The snow started on a Tuesday, which mattered to nobody in the high country because the days of the week had a way of becoming irrelevant once you were above 8,000 feet and the world had narrowed itself down to wind and cold and the sound of your own breathing. By Wednesday morning, there was no telling where the trail ended and the drop-off began, and by Wednesday afternoon the storm had stopped being weather and turned into something closer to a siege. Coulter Hayes rode through it anyway. He rode because he always rode, blizzard or no blizzard, because this was his land and he knew every rock face and frozen creek bed and dead pine cluster by heart, and because sitting still inside four walls had never come naturally to him, not even now, not even after everything. His horse, a big gray quarter horse named Dutch, moved through the drifts with the patient, methodical resignation of an animal that had long ago stopped expecting anything to be easy. They made a strange pair in the whiteout, the horse and the man and the silence between them, working a slow loop along the western ridge the way Coulter had done 3 times a week for the past 6 years. He almost missed her. The shape in the snow didn't look like a person at first. It looked like a bundle of rags or a piece of canvas that had blown off some long-abandoned wagon, dark against the white, half submerged in a drift that had built up against the base of a fallen lodgepole pine. Dutch noticed it before Coulter did. The horse slowed without being asked, ears forward, nostrils working. "What is it?" Coulter said. Not a question exactly. More the habit of talking to Dutch when there was no one else to talk to. He swung down and pushed through the snow to get closer, and then he saw the hand. It was a woman's hand, and it was still wearing a glove, and the fingers were curled slightly upward like she had been reaching for something when the cold took her under. Coulter stood there for 1 full second, which was all the time he allowed himself. And then he was digging, bare-handed, because his gloves were too thick for this kind of work, scooping snow away from her shoulders and her face. And she was young, maybe mid-20s. And she was not yet dead because he could feel the faint warmth coming off her face when he got close enough to check. "All right," he said. To her or to himself, he couldn't have told you which. He got her onto Dutch with the kind of brute efficiency that comes from spending years doing hard physical things alone, when there's no one to help you and no point in making the work dramatic. He draped her across the saddle in front of him and held her upright with one arm and used the other to manage the reins. And he turned Dutch back toward the cabin and let the horse find the way home because Dutch always knew the way home. It took 40 minutes that felt like much longer. Bess. The cabin sat at the back of a narrow mountain valley, tucked against a granite outcropping that broke the worst of the wind. Coulter had built it himself, or rather, he had built most of it, and his wife had told him where the windows ought to go, and argued with him about the size of the front room until he admitted she was right, which had taken him longer than it should have. The cabin was solid and well chinked and had survived worse winters than this one. And it was also, he was aware of this in the way you're aware of something you've stopped thinking about directly. Very quiet these days, very empty. He got the woman inside and onto his own bed because it was the only bed, laid her down on top of the blankets and pulled off her outer coat and her boots, and assessed the damage with methodical, unsentimental eyes. Her fingers were bad. Her left ear and portions of both cheeks showed the waxy, grayish discoloration that meant frostbite had already settled in. She was shivering in violent, uncontrolled waves, which was actually a good sign because shivering meant her body was still fighting, still trying to generate heat. People who had stopped shivering were the ones you worried about. He built the fire up until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm. He boiled water and soaked strips of cloth in it and laid them gently over her hands and her face. He made broth from the dried venison he kept on a high shelf, thin and not particularly flavorful, but hot, and got a few spoonfuls into her during a brief period when she was semi-conscious enough to swallow. She said something during that. He didn't catch the words. "Save it," he told her. "You don't need to talk right now." She seemed to accept that. Her eyes closed again. Coulter sat in the chair beside the bed and watched her breathe and waited for her to either get worse or get better. And outside the storm pushed against the walls with a low, sustained howl that made the lantern flame bend sideways every time the wind found the gap under the door. He did not sleep that night. He was not sure he could have, even if he had tried. She was worse by morning. The fever came on fast, the way fever always did in cases of severe exposure, her body overcompensating once it realized it was safe enough to respond. She was burning up and shivering at the same time, which was a miserable combination, and she was talking in her sleep. fragments, partial sentences, nothing that held together into meaning. Coulter kept the fire going. He replaced the compresses on her hands every hour. He managed to get a little more broth into her around midday. He was not a doctor and had never claimed to be, but he had spent enough time alone in the mountains to know the basic mechanics of keeping a person alive through exposure and cold, and he applied that knowledge with the same focused, unadorned competence he brought to everything else in his life. What he did not do was think about who she was, or where she had come from, or how she had ended up half buried in a drift on the western ridge in the middle of a blizzard. Those were questions for later. Right now she was just a person who needed to not die, and that was problem enough to be getting on with. The storm ran 3 full days. By the end of the first day, Coulter knew she would probably survive. By the end of the second, she was conscious enough to be confused, which was progress. She woke up in the afternoon of the second day and looked at the ceiling of the cabin for a long moment before she looked at him. And when she looked at him, the expression on her face was cautious, like she was deciding something. "Where am I?" she said. Her voice was rough, barely there. "My place. About 12 miles from the nearest town, which is Whitmore, which isn't much of a town." He pulled his chair a little closer to the bed so she wouldn't have to project. "What's your name?" She hesitated just a fraction of a second before she answered. He noticed that. "Evelyn," she said. "Evelyn Hart. Coulter Hayes, I found you on the West Ridge day before yesterday. You were under about 3 feet of snow." He said it plainly, without any particular inflection. He figured she deserved to know how close it had been without him making a performance out of it. Evelyn stared at him for a moment. Something moved across her face that he couldn't quite read. 3 feet? She said. "Give or take." She looked at the ceiling again. "My hands," she said. "Frostbite. Not as bad as it could have been. The fingertips are going to hurt like hellfire for a while, but I don't think you'll lose anything." She absorbed that. "The wagon," she said after a moment. "What wagon?" "There was a wagon. We were crossing through the pass and the wheel came off on a downhill and it went over the side. The driver," she stopped, closed her eyes. "I don't know what happened to the driver. I started walking and then the snow got bad and I couldn't find the trail." Coulter was quiet for a moment. "How long were you walking before I found you?" "I don't know. A long time." A pause. "It got dark." That meant she had been out in it for at least several hours, possibly longer. He had found her at around 2 in the afternoon of the second day of the storm, which meant she had either been in the mountains before the blizzard hit, or she had been very unlucky with her timing. Probably both. "Is there someone I should send word to?" he asked. "Family? Someone expecting you somewhere?" Another pause, longer this time. "No," she said. "There's no one." He nodded. He didn't push it. "You need to sleep," he said. "We can sort everything else out later when you're stronger." She looked at him again with those assessing, careful eyes. "You live here alone?" "Yes." "Why?" It was a direct question, and he was not used to direct questions, at least not from people he had known for less than a day. Most people in the territory had learned not to ask Coulter Hayes personal questions, because the look he gave them in response tended to discourage further inquiry. He gave her the look. She didn't seem particularly discouraged. "I like it that way," he said. She held his gaze for a moment that stretched just past comfortable, and then she looked away first, and something at the corner of her mouth shifted in a way that might, if you were being generous, have been described as the ghost of a smile. "I'll sleep," she said. Mocked. She slept through the night and most of the next day, waking only briefly and falling back under again quickly. The fever broke on the morning of the third day of the storm, which was also the morning the wind started to ease off. Not stop exactly, but downgrade from siege to something more like a cold and sustained argument. Coulter noticed both things at the same time and acknowledged them with the same lack of ceremony. By the afternoon of that third day, Evelyn Hart was sitting up in bed eating actual food. A bowl of thick venison stew that Coulter had put together from what he had on hand, and looking around the cabin with alert, dark eyes that were clearly cataloging everything they landed on. Coulter sat at the table across the room, working on a piece of tack that needed mending, and tried not to watch her watching his cabin. The cabin was not, he knew, a particularly welcoming space. It was functional. He had made sure of that, but the warmth had gone out of it gradually over the years, replaced by a kind of careful order that was really just another word for emptiness. There were still a few things of Sarah's on the shelves. He had not been able to bring himself to take them down. A small tin painted with flowers that she had brought from Ohio, a book of poems with a broken spine, a carved wooden figure of a deer that their son had made at age 6, badly, lopsidedly, the legs at slightly wrong angles, that Coulter had never let himself look at directly. "You made this stew?" Evelyn asked. "Yes." "How long have you been cooking for yourself?" He considered whether the question was intrusive and decided it probably wasn't. 6 years, he said. "It tastes like it." He looked up from the tack. She was watching him with that same steady, unafraid expression. "I don't mean that as an insult. It's hot and it's filling. Those are the two things it needs to be." She took another spoonful. "But you're using too much salt and not enough time. You rush the pot." Coulter was quiet for a moment. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. "Sorry, I didn't mean to." She stopped, shook her head slightly. "Old habit. I used to cook a lot." "Used to?" She looked down at her bowl. "Things change." He went back to the tack. Outside, the wind had dropped to a low moan. The storm was running out of energy, the way all storms eventually did, and the silence it left behind as it retreated was a different kind of silence than the one Coulter was used to. Fuller, somehow, charged with the presence of another person breathing across the room. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Before the wagon." She took a moment. "West," she said. "California eventually. I had an idea about San Francisco." "That's a long way from Wyoming." "Yes, it is." She set the bowl down on the blanket and folded her hands in her lap. The compresses were off now. Her fingers looked red and swollen and clearly hurt her, though she was careful not to show it. "I wasn't supposed to be on that particular road. I changed my route." "Why?" She looked at him. "Because someone was looking for me on the other one." Coulter set the tack down on the table. He looked at her steadily. "What kind of someone?" She held his gaze. She had a quality he was starting to recognize, a way of meeting difficulty directly without flinching that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the kind of people you could trust your life to, and also of the kind of people who tended to bring trouble with them wherever they went. In his experience, those were often the same people. "The kind that doesn't take no for an answer," she said. "The kind that considers no to be a temporary condition that more pressure will eventually correct." "Business trouble?" "Of a kind." She looked at her damaged hands. "My father died 8 months ago. He left me property and a small amount of money and also a business arrangement I had never agreed to, with a man named Garrison Aldcroft. Aldcroft is a mining investor out of Denver, very successful, very accustomed to getting what he wants." Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath the steadiness that told him it cost her something to keep it that way. "My father had essentially promised him my hand, along with access to the land as part of some larger arrangement I was never told about. Aldcroft expected me to honor it. And you didn't want to." I had never met the man. I didn't know anything about the arrangement until after my father died. Something hardened in her eyes. "I'm not property. I'm not part of a business deal." I told Aldcroft as much in person, in front of 2 witnesses, and he listened politely and then sent men to follow me when I left Denver. She paused. "So I ran." Coulter was quiet for a moment. "Into Wyoming," he said. It seemed remote enough. The ghost of that almost smile again. "I may have miscalculated the weather." "How many men?" "I don't know exactly, at least 2 that I identified, possibly more." She looked at him directly. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't complicate your situation. You have every right to be angry with me for bringing it to your door. You didn't bring anything to my door on purpose. You were buried in a snowdrift. That's a generous interpretation. It's the accurate one." He picked the tack back up, more out of habit than any real need to mend it right now. "Get some more rest. We'll figure out the rest of it when the pass opens." She watched him for a moment. "You're not going to ask me to leave?" "You can barely walk." "That's not what I mean." He knew it wasn't. He set the tack down again and looked at her across the cabin and said, "No, I'm not going to ask you to leave." Something in her shoulders shifted, a tension releasing that she had probably not even known was there. She nodded once, the way you nod when you've decided to take something at face value, even though experience has taught you not to. Thank you, she said. For the stew, too, even with the salt. I'll work on it, he said. Outside, the last of the blizzard was dying against the peaks, and the Wyoming mountains were pulling themselves back into their ordinary silence. The silence of snow and stone and cold air and distance. The silence that Coulter Hayes had built his life around because the alternative had once felt too hard to contemplate. It still felt hard. He was not going to pretend otherwise. But the lantern was burning on the table, and the fire was going strong. And across the room, a woman he had known for 3 days was settling back against his pillow with her damaged hands folded carefully in her lap, and the cabin felt different. He couldn't have said exactly how, just different. He went back to the tack and didn't let himself think too much about what that meant. The pass didn't open for another 4 days. Coulter knew this the morning after the storm broke, when he rode out to check the South Trail and found it buried under 6 feet of consolidated drift where it narrowed between 2 rock faces. He stood in the saddle and looked at the wall of white and did the calculation in his head. Temperature, sun angle, how much wind had been working the upper elevation, and arrived at the number 4 with the particular certainty of a man who had spent years reading this specific mountain the way other people read books. 4 days, maybe 5. The trail would not open before then, and that was just a fact. The same way the granite was a fact, and the cold was a fact, and there was no point in having feelings about it. He rode back to the cabin and told Evelyn. She was sitting at the table when he came in, which was itself a change from the previous days. She had moved herself from the bed to the chair sometime that morning and was sitting with her damaged hands resting palm up on the table in front of her, fingers spread slightly, an expression on her face that suggested she was conducting some private assessment of how much they still hurt and whether the answer was improving. She looked up when he came through the door, read his expression, and waited. 4 days, he said, maybe more. There's a drift on the South Trail that won't clear before then. She nodded. All right. That was all she said. No complaint, no visible alarm, just that small nod of acceptance. Though he had begun to understand that Evelyn Hart's acceptance of difficult news was not the same thing as indifference. She processed things quietly, turned them over internally, and only brought out the results once she'd sorted through them. It was a quality he recognized because it was more or less how he operated himself, and recognizing it in someone else was an odd feeling that he set aside and didn't examine too closely. How are the hands? He asked, hanging his coat and hat by the door. Better, the right one especially. She turned it over slowly and made a fist, incomplete, the fingers not closing all the way. The left is still stiff. That'll take longer. Give it time. I'm not known for patience. You've done all right so far. She glanced at him, one of those quick, assessing looks that he was becoming familiar with, and then back at her hands. I suppose being unconscious for half of it helped. He went to the stove to check the coffee, which he had put on before he rode out. It was strong and slightly overbrewed, the way it always was when he forgot about it, and he poured 2 cups without thinking about it and set one in front of her before catching himself. Thank you, she said. I wasn't... He stopped. The polite thing was to not finish that sentence. He sat down across the table with his own cup. Evelyn looked at the coffee, then at him, and there was something in her expression that was trying hard not to be amused and not entirely succeeding. She picked up the cup carefully with both hands, easier to manage that way with the stiff fingers, and drank. There was a silence that was not particularly uncomfortable, which surprised him. Most silences with other people had a social weight to them, a pressure to be filled. This one just sat there between them like the morning itself, not demanding anything. What do you need to do today? She asked after a while. There's a section of fence on the north side that I need to check. The drifts may have taken it down, and I need to clear the path to the woodshed. He paused. Why? I want to be useful while I'm here. He looked at her hands. Not with the hands, she said, slightly impatient in a way that was clearly directed at herself more than him. I know, but there must be something I can do that doesn't require full grip strength. She looked around the cabin. When did you last clean this place? He thought about it. October. She did not say anything to that, but the quality of her silence was expressive. It's a working cabin, he said. It's a working cabin with 2 months of dust on every flat surface, and a coffee pot that I suspect hasn't been properly scoured since before the first snowfall. She set her cup down. Let me be useful, Coulter. I'll go out of my mind otherwise. It was the first time she had used his name. It landed differently than he had expected, which was another thing he set aside. Fine, he said. There's a broom behind the door. He was gone most of the morning, and when he came back through the door at midday, the cabin smelled different. It took him a moment to identify what had changed, and then he realized it was the smell of something actually cooking, not his standard production of boiling water and adding whatever was available in rough proportion, but real cooking, the kind that involved layering and timing and apparently some reorganization of his entire spice shelf, which he could see had been taken down, assessed and replaced in a different order. Evelyn was at the stove. She had her back to him, and she was stirring something in the big cast-iron pot that he mainly used for laundry. She heard him come in and said without turning around, "Wash your hands before you come near this pot." "It's my pot. And it's going to have a decent meal in it for the first time in what I suspect is years, so wash your hands." He washed his hands. The meal was venison, same venison he had been eating for weeks, but she had done something to it that he could not immediately account for. Something with the dried herbs on the shelf and a long, slow heat and some instinct that apparently he did not possess. And the result was a stew that tasted the way stew was supposed to taste, the way he remembered stew tasting once, a long time ago. He ate most of it before he said anything. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" She had been watching him eat with a self-contained expression that was not quite satisfaction and not quite something else. "My mother, before she died, when I was 12. She was eating more slowly, in part because of the hands. We didn't have a lot of money when I was young, before my father's business grew. Learning to cook well with very little was practical, not decorative. What kind of business did your father run?" "Timber, originally. Then he expanded into land speculation, buying parcels along projected rail routes and selling them at profit when the surveys came through." She paused. "He was good at it, better at that than he ever was at most other things." A beat. "He was not particularly good at being a father." He said nothing. The stove ticked in the silence. "I don't mean that to sound bitter," she said. "It's just accurate. He was a man who was very good at acquiring things and not very good at knowing their value once he had them." She looked at her bowl. "He acquired me the same way, I think, and when he died, he found one more thing to do with me." The arrangement with Aldcroft. Coulter turned his spoon in the stew. "How long did you know about it before you left Denver?" 2 weeks. It took me that long to gather what I could take with me and make a plan." She set down her spoon. "I want to be clear about something. I did not leave because I was afraid of Aldcroft exactly. I left because I was not willing to have my future decided by people who had not consulted me about it. That's a different thing." "Is it?" "Yes. Fear is reactive. What I did was a choice." She looked at him steadily. "There's a difference between running away and walking towards something, even if the direction looks the same from the outside." Coulter looked at her for a moment. Outside, the snow was starting to come down again, lighter now, more of a dusting than a storm, and it caught the thin afternoon light through the window and turned it a particular shade of pale gray that he associated with the deepest part of winter in the high country. "What were you walking toward?" he asked. She was quiet for a beat. "Somewhere I could exist on my own terms." She said it simply, without drama. "Somewhere I could make decisions about my own life without needing permission or fighting for the right to do it. California seemed far enough." "California's a long way, and it's not necessarily what people imagine it is." "I know that," a slight edge in her voice. "I'm not naive. I wasn't expecting to arrive somewhere perfect. I was expecting to arrive somewhere I had chosen myself." He nodded. He could understand that. He had in his own way done something similar, come up to these mountains 6 years ago, not because they were easy, but because the choice to come had been entirely his own, made with clear eyes, for reasons that were completely his, even if they were also completely devastating. He didn't say any of that. But he thought she might have read some version of it in his expression, because her own face shifted slightly, a small softening, like she was revising some early assessment of him. "Thank you for the meal," he said. "Thank you for the venison," she said. "However it is you ended up with that much of it." The days settled into a rhythm that neither of them quite designed. Coulter rode out each morning to do what the land and the season required: check fences and trails, tend to Dutch, haul wood, assess the drift on the South Pass, which was melting with the infuriating slowness of something that knew you were watching. Evelyn spent the mornings working through the cabin with a systematic efficiency that he found both quietly impressive and faintly unsettling, in the way that any significant change to an established order is unsettling even when the change is an improvement. She was not precious about the work. She swept and scoured and reorganized without ceremony, without comment, without any of the self-congratulatory energy that some people brought to helping in someone else's space. When she found things that had clearly been left undisturbed for years, a stack of papers on the far shelf, a coat hanging on a peg that was too small for Coulter's shoulders, she left them where they were without asking about them. She understood instinctively the difference between cleaning and intruding. The coat had been Sarah's. He noticed that Evelyn noticed it and then chose not to notice it, and he was grateful for that in a way he couldn't have put into words. The afternoons were a looser arrangement. Sometimes he was still out. Sometimes he came in early when the cold was particularly bitter and found her sitting with the book from the shelf. Not Sarah's poetry, she had left that alone, but a battered surveying manual he had owned for years and never actually read. She was working through it with the focused attention of someone acquiring information for a specific purpose. "Planning a survey?" he asked, the first afternoon he found her with it. "I'm interested in how land gets evaluated," she said, "and how they decide what something is worth." She didn't look up immediately. "It's useful to understand the system if the system is the thing that's being used against you." He sat down and thought about that. "Aldcroft's interest isn't just in you personally," he said. It was not quite a question. She set the book down then. "The land my father left me is in the Eastern Range, outside of Casper. About 400 acres. There's a creek running through it, and what they think is a coal seam in the eastern corner." She folded her hands carefully in her lap. "Aldcroft has been positioning himself in the territory for 2 years. He's been buying up mineral rights along the rail line. My land fills a gap in what he's assembling." She paused. "The arrangement with me was never really about me. I was just the simplest path to the land. Does he know that you know that?" "He does now. It was one of the things I told him in Denver, in front of those witnesses." Something moved across her face, hard and clear, like light on a blade. "I told him I understood exactly what he was buying, and I told him it was not for sale." Coulter was quiet for a long moment. "That's why he sent the men." "Yes, because a woman who doesn't understand the transaction can be redirected. A woman who understands it exactly and refuses anyway is a different kind of problem." He thought about the kind of man Garrison Aldcroft was, assembled from the description and what he knew about how money and land and power moved through the territory these days, and he arrived at a picture that he did not like. Men like that did not stop because a woman said no. Men like that revised their approach until they found an angle that worked. "When the pass opens," he said carefully, "you can't just go back on the main road." "I know that." "If his men are in the territory—" "I know, Coulter." Her voice was patient, but there was steel beneath it. "I have been thinking about very little else for 4 days. I am aware that my situation has complications. I am trying to determine the best path through them." She held his gaze. "Which is why I was reading the surveying manual." He looked at the book in her hands, then at her. "What are you thinking?" She was quiet for a moment, working something through. "If I can establish a formal claim on the land, file the papers myself at the territorial office with proper documentation of my inheritance, it becomes substantially harder for Aldcroft to acquire it through other means. Legal pressure, hostile sale, whatever he's planning. The land being properly and publicly in my name complicates his position." "But—" She paused. "The problem is getting to the territorial office without Aldcroft's men knowing where I am. And without money," he said. "I'm assuming you didn't get far out of Denver with much." A small beat. "I have some," she said. "Enough to travel on, if I'm careful. I was careful to make sure of that before I left." She paused. "I converted what I could to a bank draft. It's sewn into the lining of my coat." He glanced at the coat by the door. Hers, which she had been wearing when he found her, and which was now reasonably dry and hanging beside his on the peg near the door. He said nothing about that detail because it was exactly the sort of practical, clear-headed thinking that he was starting to expect from her and that kept catching him slightly off guard. "There's a territorial office in Cheyenne," he said. "I know. It's where I need to get to. That's 3 days by horse from here, in good weather. With the roads in the condition they're going to be in after this storm, it's 4, possibly 5. She nodded. "I'd calculated something similar." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I know a back route, south of the main road through the foothills. It adds half a day, but it avoids the main crossings where someone watching the territory would post a man." Evelyn went very still. "I'm not going with you," he said quickly, and the quickness of it was its own kind of tell. "I'm just saying I know the route, and I can describe it clearly enough that you could follow it." She looked at him for a moment with that steady, reading gaze. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They both looked at a point roughly in the middle distance between them, and outside the snow kept coming down in its light, unhurried way, and neither of them said what the silence was probably saying. 3 evenings later, they were sitting at the table after supper. She had made something with cornmeal and dried apples that was better than anything that had come out of that kitchen in a long time, and he had made coffee that was only slightly overbrewed, and she was telling him about Denver. Not Aldcroft, not the arrangement, just Denver itself, what it had been like to live there after the money came and before her father died, the particular absurdity of a social world that had very firm ideas about what a woman of some means was supposed to do with herself, and said ideas did not include reading land surveys or asking direct questions at business meetings. "They would look at my father," she said, "even when I was the one who had asked the question, as if the question must have originated with him and just happened to be coming out of my mouth." "Did that happen often?" "Every time I was in the same room as a business conversation." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Her fingers were moving much more freely now, the stiffness mostly gone from the right hand and fading from the left. "After a while I stopped going. It wasn't worth the—" She searched for the word. "The constant reminder that my presence was considered decorative." That must have been lonely. It came out before he'd fully decided to say it, and it hung in the air for a moment, more personal than the conversation had been running. He considered walking it back, and then decided that would be worse. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't quite seen from her before, softer around the edges. "Yes," she said. "It was." A pause. "Is." The fire popped in the stove. Dutch made a sound in the lean-to, settling for the night. The lantern on the table burned with the small, steady patience of something that didn't need anything from either of them. "You lost someone," she said. It was not a question. "Here, in this cabin." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "How long ago?" 6 years. He looked at the table surface. The wood was old and worn smooth in the places where hands had rested on it most. "My wife and my son. He was 4. He stopped. He did not usually say it that precisely, the age. Usually he kept it at just his son, without the number, because the number made it too specific. "Fever. Both of them, 3 days apart." Evelyn said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "I'm sorry. It was 6 years ago." "That doesn't change what I said." He looked up at her. She was watching him with an expression that was careful and honest and did not contain anything he had to defend himself against. No pity in the suffocating sense, no performance of sympathy, just a steady acknowledgement of a real and terrible thing. "I came up here afterward," he said. "I had the land already. We had come up to look at it the summer before. The plan was to build here together." He looked at the window, the dark and the snow beyond it. "I built it anyway. It seemed like the only thing to do." "Why?" "Because I had to do something, and because—" He stopped, started again, more carefully. "Because staying in town felt like drowning slowly. At least up here it was just me and the mountain and the work. You can't drown in work. You just get tired and you sleep and you wake up and there's more work." She nodded. She understood that, he could tell. Not from personal experience of the same loss, but from some adjacent experience of trying to outrun something by staying in motion. "The coat on the peg," she said. "By the door." "Yes." "You don't have to explain." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Her name was Sarah. She was from Ohio. She hated cold weather, and she came up here anyway because I wanted to, and she trusted that I knew what I was doing. A pause, and then, in a different voice, I'm not sure I did know what I was doing. You built the cabin. The cabin's fine. The rest of it... He stopped himself. This was more than he had said to anyone in 6 years, possibly longer, and he wasn't sure where it was coming from, except that there was something about Evelyn Hart, the directness of her, the way she didn't require things to be dressed up or softened, that made it possible to say things plainly. You've been punishing yourself, she said. Not an accusation, just an observation, precise and clean. He looked at her. Living up here alone, she said, reducing your life down to just the work and the mountain. It keeps you from having to risk anything. She said it without cruelty. I understand that impulse. I lived a version of it in Denver, in the room I was supposed to be decorative in. You make yourself small enough that nothing can reach you. It's not the same. No, she agreed. It's not. Yours is braver in a way. At least you chose your isolation. Mine was imposed on me. She paused. But the result is similar. You stop being a person who wants things because wanting things means they can be taken away. The fire in the stove was burning lower, the kind of low that meant it needed feeding in the next few minutes or it would start to lose ground against the cold. Neither of them moved to feed it. What do you want? He asked. He wasn't sure why he asked it or why it felt important. She looked at him across the table in the small, warm light. I want to stand in front of a land office window and file my own papers and have the clerk look at me when he stamps them instead of looking for a man behind me. She said it simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I want to make decisions about my own life. I want to exist somewhere without apology. She paused. Those are not small things, I know, but they're what I want. Coulter was quiet for a moment, then he said, No, they're not small things. He got up and fed the fire. When he sat back down, the conversation had shifted into something slightly different, quieter, less exposed, the way a fire settles once it's been tended. They talked for a while longer about practical things, the pass and the route, and what she would need to carry when she traveled. And the practicality of it was almost a relief, something solid to put their hands on after the other conversation. But when he finally banked the stove for the night and turned down the lantern, and she moved to the bed and he moved to the pallet he had made himself near the fire. This had been the arrangement since she was well enough to sleep normally, and he had enough blankets to manage it adequately. The cabin held the earlier conversation in it the way a room holds warmth after the fire has been banked, still present, fading slowly. He lay in the dark and listened to the mountain and tried not to think about the fact that in 4 days, maybe 5, the South Trail would be passable. He was not particularly successful. The 4th day after the storm, she repaired his coat. He had not asked her to. He had worn that coat for 2 winters with a split seam along the left shoulder that he had been meaning to mend and hadn't, because mending things required sitting still for extended periods, and he generally found reasons to avoid that. He came in from the morning ride to find her at the table with the coat in her lap, and a needle and thread from the small kit she had apparently carried in her bag through the whole disaster of the mountains, working the seam with careful, even stitches. You don't have to do that, he said. I know. She didn't look up. Sit down. There's coffee. He poured a cup and stood watching her work. She stitched quickly and economically, no wasted motion. The left hand was nearly back to full function now, he noticed. She had been working it deliberately all week, small intentional movements throughout the day, rebuilding what the cold had stiffened. When I was 12, she said, not looking up, after my mother died, I had to learn to do everything she had done for the household. My father was not... He didn't adapt well to practical matters. He needed someone to manage things. Her needle moved through the heavy fabric with a thin, clean sound. I learned to sew because we couldn't afford to pay someone to do it. I learned to cook for the same reason. I learned to keep books because my father kept losing track of what he owed and what was owed to him. A pause. People assumed later, when the money came, that I had always had the skills of someone who could afford help. They didn't know the skills came from not being able to afford it. You didn't correct them. It never seemed worth the explanation. She pulled the thread through and examined the seam. People believe what's convenient. Correcting them just makes you difficult. He sat down with his coffee. He thought about that, about the particular exhaustion of being in rooms where everyone had already decided what you were. The route I mentioned, he said, through the foothills, I've been thinking about it. She looked up then. There's a way station at mile 47 on that road, run by a man named Beauchamp, Pete Beauchamp. He's been out there 15 years. He doesn't have loyalties to anyone, and he's not particularly interested in other people's business. You could overnight there safely. He paused. He'd also know if there were strangers on the road, whether Aldcroft's men have moved into that corridor. You know him well? Well enough. He sold me the breeding pair I started my herd from 4 years ago. Fair man. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then, You've been planning this. I've been thinking about the practical side of it, yes. She looked at him with that steady, level gaze. Why? He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Because you came here by accident, and you're in a bad position through no fault of your own, and I know the territory and you don't, and that's information that costs me nothing to share. He said it factually, without making it into more than it was. She kept looking at him. That's not the whole reason. He looked out the window. The sky had the particular flat brightness of high-altitude winter sunlight on fresh snow, almost harsh, a white that was close to painful if you looked straight at it. The south trail, he calculated, was probably another 2 days from passable, maybe 2.5. No, he said, it's not the whole reason. He did not elaborate, and she did not push him. She looked back down at the coat in her lap and made 2 more careful stitches, and then bit the thread clean and held the coat up to examine her work in the morning light. There, she said. She set it on the table between them, the seam smooth and even and solid. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at her. Thank you, he said. She nodded. She was already reaching for the coffee. The south trail opened on the 5th day, not the 4th. Coulter knew it before he rode out to check it. Something in the sound of the mountain in the early morning, a quality of the meltwater running off the roof that told him the temperature had dropped again overnight and refrozen the upper surface of the drifts. He went anyway, because knowing something and confirming it are different habits, and he had always preferred confirmation. Dutch picked his way down the trail with the careful, deliberate footwork of an animal that understood ice, and Coulter sat the saddle and let him work and looked at the sky and thought about things he had been trying not to think about. The drift on the South Pass had settled and crusted over. Another day? Maybe a day and a half. He turned Dutch around and headed back. When he told Evelyn, she nodded the same way she had nodded to the first delay, accepting, composed. But this time there was something else underneath the composure that he caught in the brief moment before she arranged her expression. Not dread, not impatience exactly, something more complicated than either of those. He understood it because he felt a version of it himself, and that was the most unsettling thing of all. The day had a slightly different quality than the days before it. They both felt the trail opening in the near distance, felt the approaching end of the particular closed world the blizzard had made for them, and it put a subtle pressure on the ordinary hours that hadn't been there before. Evelyn was quieter at breakfast. Coulter found himself checking on Dutch twice in the morning, when once would have been sufficient. Small behaviors, barely noticeable, that added up to something neither of them said out loud. He decided that afternoon to ride into Whitmore. It was a practical decision. He needed to resupply before she left. Trail provisions, the kind of concentrated food that traveled well and kept. And he needed to talk to Walt Greeley at the general store, who was the closest thing the territory had to a reliable news source, because Walt had family connections east toward Casper and heard things from passing travelers that most people in the high country didn't hear for weeks. If Aldcroft's men had been in the territory with any visibility, Walt would know something about it. He told Evelyn he was riding into town for supplies. He did not tell her the other reason, which was not entirely deception. It was more that he didn't want to say the words Aldcroft's men out loud until he had something concrete to say along with them. She did not ask for details. She asked him to bring back salt pork if Walt had it, and coffee that wasn't already ground to powder, and he said he'd see what he could do. The ride into Whitmore took an hour and a half on the cleared lower road, which was sloppy with melt and churned by what traffic had moved through since the storm. Whitmore was not a prosperous town by any reasonable standard. A general store, a livery, a small hotel that also served as the local saloon, a post office operating out of the back room of a harness shop, and enough houses scattered along the main street to suggest permanence without actually achieving it. Coulter had a functional relationship with the town, which meant he went when he needed things and left when he had them. And over 6 years, he had cultivated a reputation for being a man who did not invite conversation and was not bothered by other people's business. This reputation had served him well, and he had worked to maintain it. He tied Dutch at the post outside the general store and went in. Walt Greeley was behind the counter, which is where Walt Greeley always was, a large, red-faced man in his late 50s who projected an air of comfortable immovability as though the counter had been built around him specifically. He looked up when Coulter came in, registered no particular surprise. Coulter was a regular enough presence that surprise would have been its own kind of comment, and said, "Road's clear enough for you, finally?" Getting there. "I need salt pork, coffee, whole bean if you have it, dried beans, hard biscuit, and oats." He paused. "And whatever you've heard lately." Walt raised an eyebrow. That was new. Coulter had never asked for whatever he'd heard. Coulter was categorically the kind of man who did not ask for whatever people had heard. "Heard about what?" Walt said. "Strangers in the territory. Men who came in during or just before the storm. Not local, not ranchers." Walt studied him for a moment with the particular stillness of a man deciding how much to say. Then he turned and started pulling items from the shelves behind him. "2 men came through here 3 days into the storm," he said, his back to Coulter. "Rode in from the east. Buckley over at the hotel put them up for 2 nights. He set the salt pork on the counter. "Not the kind of men who talk much about themselves." "What kind of men are they?" "The kind who ask questions without answering any." Walt set the coffee down. "They were asking about a woman, young, dark-haired, traveling alone or close to it. Asked Buckley if anyone had come through before the storm. Asked the postmaster if he'd received any unusual inquiries." He turned around and looked at Coulter directly. "They left 2 days ago, heading south toward Laramie, or so they said." Coulter kept his face neutral. "Heading south. That's what they said. Whether that's where they went is a different question." Walt leaned on the counter slightly. "You find something interesting out on your West Ridge, Coulter?" There it was. He had known it was coming. This was Whitmore, and things that happened on the roads near Whitmore had a way of getting back to people who paid attention. Someone had seen him ride in with a shape across his saddle, or Dutch's tracks in the snow had told a story to whoever had been out on the low road during the storm's aftermath. It didn't matter which. "I found a traveler in the snow," he said. "Wagon went over in the pass. She was on foot in the blizzard." "She." Walt said the word without inflection, which was its own kind of inflection. "Yes, she." Walt nodded slowly. He picked up the coffee again and began wrapping it. "Young woman," he said, "traveling alone." "Wagon disaster," Coulter said. "No one else survived from what I can tell. She's been at the cabin while the trail was closed." Walt looked at him for a moment. Something in his expression was not quite judgment. Walt Greeley was too practically minded for outright judgment, but it was in the neighborhood of concern, the kind of concern a person has when they can see a situation developing and they aren't sure it's going to develop well. "People will talk," Walt said. "You know that." "People can do whatever they like." Coulter. Walt set the wrapped goods down and put both hands on the counter. "I'm not telling you your business. I'm telling you what's going to happen, because you've been up that mountain long enough that you may have forgotten how things work down here." He paused. "A young woman, alone, at a bachelor's cabin for the better part of a week. People are going to build a story around that whether you like it or not, and the kind of story they build is going to affect her as much as you. Maybe more." Coulter was quiet. He was aware that Walt was right. He was also aware that there was a version of Walt's concern that came from genuine care and a version that came from the small-town instinct to enforce propriety, and that both versions existed simultaneously in the same man, and there was no clean way to separate them. "She'll be leaving when the pass opens," he said. "Tomorrow or the day after." "And going where?" "That's her business." Walt held his gaze for a moment and then nodded. "Fair enough." He began totaling the goods. "The men asking questions about the woman, I don't know who sent them or why, but they had money, and men with money on a purpose tend to be persistent." He slid the paper across the counter with the total. "Just so you know." Coulter paid and gathered the supplies. At the door he stopped. "The men asking questions," he said. "You said they left south. Did they say anything about coming back through?" Walt considered. "They didn't say. But Buckley mentioned they paid for stabling their horses through the end of the month." He let that sit for a moment. Make of that what you will. Coulter made of it exactly what it was, men who had paid for a place to return to, and he carried that knowledge out with him into the cold afternoon and tied the supplies to Dutch's saddle and stood for a moment in the muddy street of Whitmore with his hand on the horse's neck and looked north toward the mountain. He had ridden into town looking for information, and he had found it, and the shape of what he'd found was worse than he had hoped and better than he had feared, which was the way most information came. They had left. They might come back. The window was real but not guaranteed. He mounted up and rode for home. But Evelyn knew something was wrong before he had fully closed the door behind him. He was not sure what told her. His face, his pace, the particular way he set the supplies on the table without the usual inventory of what he'd managed to find. She was sitting by the stove where the afternoon light came in good, and she had been reading the surveying manual again, and she closed it and set it on the table and waited. He told her what Walt had said, all of it, the two men, the questions, the direction they had ridden, the stabling arrangement. He told her straight, without softening it or adding anything, because she deserved the accurate version, and she was clearly capable of handling it. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "End of the month," she said. "That's 2.5 weeks. "Yes, so they're not gone. They've repositioned." She looked at the far wall, thinking. "They couldn't find me on the main road, so they've widened the search. They may have men in Laramie as well, and possibly Cheyenne." She was working it through methodically, her voice steady, but he could see the effort the steadiness cost her, a slight tightness around the eyes, a control in the jaw that was just barely visible. "They know approximately where I went. They're not sure where I am now, but they know the territory I'm in. The foothills route avoids the main crossing at Glendon," Coulter said. "That's where you'd most naturally be watched." "But it doesn't avoid all the crossings." She looked at him. "And I'd be alone on that road for 4 days. If they're thorough, you wouldn't be alone for all of it." She stopped. Coulter had not planned to say it that way. He had not, if he was honest with himself, entirely planned to say it at all. He had been building toward some version of it since he turned Dutch north from Whitmore, but he had not constructed the specific sentence, and so when it came out plainly, without the context he might have given it if he'd thought it through more carefully. "I know the foothills route better than anyone," he said, "and I can take you to Beauchamp's way station, and from there, you're a day from the main Cheyenne road at a point where it's much harder to watch effectively. Too many converging trails." Evelyn looked at him for a long, careful moment. "You said you weren't going with me." "I said I wasn't going with you when I thought the route was clear enough that you didn't need someone who knew it." He met her eyes. "The situation has changed. You have land to manage, livestock. I have Dutch and 3 range horses, and they can last without me for a week. I've done it before." He paused. "And Pete Beauchamp's boy rides out this way sometimes in the early spring. I can send word with him to check on the horses." She was quiet, looking at him with an expression that was harder to read than most of her expressions, layered, working through something. "Coulter," she said carefully, "I need you to be honest with me about why you're doing this." He had known she would ask. He had been deciding what to say since the moment the offer had come out of his mouth on the cold Whitmore street with the mountain in front of him. He decided to give her the same thing she had always given him. "Because the situation warrants it," he said, "and because I don't want you on that road alone with men like that in the territory." He paused. "Those are both true at the same time." She held his gaze for what felt like a full minute, though it was probably less than half of one. "All right," she said finally. "When do we leave?" "Day after tomorrow, if the trail is clear enough. We'll need to be moving before light." She nodded. She picked up the surveying manual and opened it again, though he doubted she was actually reading it. He began sorting the supplies into what needed to be stored and what needed to be packed for travel. The cabin was quiet around them in the way it had learned to be quiet with 2 people in it, which was a different quality of quiet than the kind it had held for 6 years before. That evening, something changed in the texture of the hours, and Coulter felt it without being able to name it precisely. They ate. She had found a way to make the hard biscuit into something edible by soaking it and frying it with the salt pork, which he would not have thought to do. And they talked about the route. He described the foothills road in detail, the landmarks, the the creek crossings, the places where the trail split and the correct fork to take. She listened with complete attention and asked precise, practical questions that told him she had a good spatial memory and was already building the route in her head as he described it. He found himself noticing things about the way she listened, the slight forward lean when she was focused on something, the way her right hand moved occasionally as if she were sketching the road on the table's surface, the fact that she never asked him to repeat himself. He stopped noticing and paid attention to the route description instead. After they had finished with the route and the practical preparations, they stayed at the table longer than they usually did. He couldn't account for it exactly. The conversation had moved on to easier things. She told him about a summer she had spent as a girl at a cousin's farm in Ohio, which was the first time she had mentioned anywhere she'd been with any affection attached to it, and he found himself asking questions he didn't strictly need the answers to, just to hear more of it. She had a way of telling things that was spare and precise, but not cold. She selected the detail that mattered and left the rest out. And the detail she chose was always the one that made the story true rather than just accurate. "You remember very specifically," he said. "I've had to," she said. "When you grow up in a house where people revise things, where the story gets changed to suit the moment, you learn to hold on to the actual version very carefully." She turned her coffee cup. "My father was very good at revising. The way he told things, he was always the central figure, always the one who had made the right decision, even when the right decision had in fact been someone else's. Usually my mother's." A pause. "I was 12 when she died, and I had already noticed it. That took me a long time to understand, that noticing it at 12 was not normal, that most children don't have to audit the stories they're told about their own family." "No," Coulter said. "They don't." "Sarah," she said, and she said the name carefully, the way you handle something that belongs to someone else. Did she tell things accurately? He thought about it. Not about whether to answer, but actually thinking about the question, because it was a real question and deserved a real answer. "She told things too kindly," he said finally. "She had a habit of leaving out the part where people had behaved badly. She'd tell you a story and you'd come away thinking everyone in it was decent, and you'd find out later there had been a genuine villain in the middle of it that she'd just quietly edited out." He paused. "I used to argue with her about it. I told her it was dishonest. She said it was merciful." A long pause. "I think she was right, actually. I've had 6 years to come around to her position." Evelyn looked at him with the soft, honest expression he had only started to see in the last few days, the one that made her look younger and also somehow more certain at the same time. "What was she like?" she asked. "Just generally. Not the tragedy of it. Just her." It was such a specific ask. Not what happened, but who she was. He hadn't been asked that before. People had expressed condolences, which was about the loss, or they'd said nothing, which was about their own discomfort. No one had just asked who Sarah was. "Stubborn," he said. And then the word opened something up and he kept going, carefully, like a man testing ice. She had opinions about everything, and she stated them without preamble. She was not graceful. She knocked things over. She tripped on stairs she had climbed 100 times. She was from a city, and she never fully made peace with mud. But she waded through it anyway because she wasn't going to let mud make decisions for her. He paused. "She was afraid of horses, and she never told me until after we had been up here for a year because she didn't want me to know there was something she couldn't do." He looked at the table. "When I found out, I was furious with her for not saying. She laughed and said, 'I didn't need to tell you because I figured it out.'" He stopped. He had not said this much about Sarah in 6 years to any living person. She had figured it out. She was perfectly competent with horses by the time she told me she'd ever been afraid of them. The lantern on the table burned between them. Outside, the temperature was dropping for the night, and the cabin made the small ticking sounds it always made when the cold came in, the wood contracting, the metal fittings settling. "She sounds like someone worth being afraid to lose," Evelyn said. "Yes." He looked up. She was. Evelyn nodded. She did not say anything else about it, and he was grateful for that too. Grateful that she knew when to leave something where it lay. He banked the fire a while later and turned the lantern down, and the cabin settled toward sleep. But Coulter lay on his pallet in the dark, and looked at the ceiling and was honest with himself in the way he had largely stopped being honest with himself sometime around the second year alone on the mountain. He did not want her to go. It was not a complicated feeling. It was a simple and inconvenient and somewhat alarming feeling, and it was not new. It had been building for days in the small, ordinary moments of the cabin, in the quality of the coffee now that she'd shown him what he was doing wrong with the heat, in the mended seam on his coat, in the sound of another person's breathing on the other side of the room. The feeling had been accumulating the way snow accumulates, gradually, quietly, and then all at once more than you had realized. He knew what it meant. He also knew all the reasons it was complicated and possibly unwise, beginning with the fact that she was a woman trying to get somewhere of her own choosing, and he was a man who had spent 6 years building a life around being alone, and whatever he felt right now had not been invited and was not his to act on. He resolved to ride with her to Beauchamp's way station, see her safely to the Cheyenne Road, and come home. It was a clear and practical resolution, and he was fairly confident in it. The morning before they were to leave, Coulter rode into Whitmore a second time. He went for 2 reasons. The first was to settle a month's credit at the general store in case he was gone longer than expected. The second was to make a quiet inquiry at the hotel, to find out from Buckley whether the 2 men had made any contact since they'd left, whether any messages had come through, whether there was any indication of when they might return. He got to Whitmore a little before 10 and tied Dutch at the general store and went to settle the credit with Walt, who asked no questions, which told Coulter that Walt had thought about their last conversation and arrived at a reasonable position on it. Coulter appreciated that without saying so. At the hotel, Buckley was at his desk in the small front room, working through what appeared to be a ledger with the focused, unhappy expression of a man discovering that the numbers are not cooperating. He was a thin man, 50s, with a neat gray beard that he seemed to consider his most reliable quality, and he looked up at Coulter with a careful neutrality that was its own kind of information. "Hayes," he said. "Buckley." Coulter stood at the desk without taking the offered chair. "The 2 men who were here during the storm. Have you heard from them since they left?" Buckley set down his pen. "Not personally, but a rider came through yesterday with a message to be posted if they returned. I sent it on to the post office." He paused, choosing his words. "I also heard from the Hennessy boy. He's been riding the eastern road doing odd deliveries since the thaw, that he passed 2 men answering the description camped about 6 miles south of the Glendon crossing. That was day before yesterday. So they had not gone to Laramie, or if they had come back faster than expected." "The message," Coulter said. "Do you know what it said?" "I'm not in the habit of reading other people's correspondence. I'm not asking what it said word for word. I'm asking what kind of message it was." Buckley looked at him for a moment. "The kind that updates a search," he said finally. "Based on what the Hennessy boy told me, the men at the Glendon crossing had been asking questions. One of the families on the East Road, the Pritchards, they have a daughter who mentioned seeing a woman riding with a mountain man headed north during a break in the storm about 10 days back." He paused. It was apparently specific enough to narrow things down. Coulter stood very still. The Pritchard farm was on the lower road. He had passed it on the way into Whitmore with Evelyn on that first ride. Not 10 days ago, but 2 weeks ago, before the worst of the blizzard, when he had gone to check on the trail, and she had asked to come along to get out of the cabin. She had needed the air, and he had thought the lower road was safe enough. Someone at the Pritchard farm had seen them. "How specific was specific?" he asked. Buckley looked uncomfortable. "Specific enough that they're looking at cabins in the high country north of the lower road," he said. "They may not know which one, but they're narrowing." Coulter nodded once. "Thank you," he said. He walked out of the hotel and untied Dutch and rode back toward the mountain, not hurrying because hurrying would attract attention on the main street, but holding Dutch to the fastest walk the horse could manage and doing calculations the whole way. They had to leave that night. The south trail wouldn't be fully clear. The temperature had dropped again overnight, and the surface would be crusted and uncertain in places, and riding it before dawn in the cold dark was not ideal by any measure he could apply to it. But the alternative was waiting for a better trail condition that might also be a trail with 2 of Aldcroft's men on the far end of it, and that calculation was not close. He got back to the cabin in just over an hour. Evelyn was outside when he rode up, carrying an armload of wood from the shed to the porch, and she took one look at his face and set the wood down. "Tonight," she said. Not a question. "Tonight, a few hours after dark, when the temperature steadies." He dismounted and began unsaddling Dutch immediately. The horse needed a couple of hours of rest and feed before they rode again. "They're 6 miles south of Glendon. Someone saw us on the lower road. They've narrowed the area." She stood for a moment, her arms empty where the wood had been. He watched her absorb the information, the calculation running behind her eyes, the assessment of the situation, the resolution forming. "All right," she said. "What do we need to do before dark?" It was the right question, not how or why or some variation of alarm. Just the practical, forward-facing question of what needed to happen next. He told her. They went inside and worked steadily through the afternoon, packing the trail supplies, preparing the horses, laying out what she would need in a roll that could go across the saddle of the second range horse, a solid bay mare named Cass who was competent on uncertain terrain. He showed Evelyn how Cass liked to be handled, the particular way she needed to be approached from the left, and the habit she had of testing the bit in the first 10 minutes of every ride. "Once she settles, she's reliable," he said. "She's not fast, but she's steady, and steady is what you want on that road." "I haven't ridden much," Evelyn said. She said it the way she had said things that reflected badly on her preparation, directly, without apology, but without pretense either. "How much is not much? Enough to stay on, not enough to feel confident about it." She was looking at Cass with the expression of someone assessing an obstacle. "I can do it. I just wanted you to know." "I know," he said. "We won't go faster than you can manage." She nodded. She reached out and let Cass smell her hand, which was the right instinct, and Cass dropped her nose to investigate, which was a good sign. At dusk, Coulter walked the perimeter of the property, a habit he had before any extended absence, checking the fence lines, making sure the 2 remaining range horses had water and enough feed to last, latching the lean-to properly. The mountains were gold, and then orange, and then the particular deep blue of high-altitude dusk, the peaks cutting sharp silhouettes against a sky that had gone almost violet at the horizon. He stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the cabin, the lantern light in the window, the smoke from the stove, and felt the complicated weight of leaving it, not just for this trip, but something underneath the trip, something about what it meant that he was leaving it all. He had not left this mountain for anything other than necessity in 6 years. He had been on it through 4 winters and 3 droughts, and a summer fire that had burned the southern timber a mile below and stopped at the granite shelf. The mountain had been the whole perimeter of his life, and he had chosen that, deliberately, and he had told himself he was at peace with it. Standing at the edge of the yard in the blue evening with the lantern light in the window, he knew he had been lying to himself. Not cruelly lying, the kind of lying that starts as protection and then becomes such a habit you forget it's a lie. The kind you don't recognize until something changes the light and you see the whole shape of it clearly for the first time. He went back inside. Evelyn had made food for the road, the remaining hard biscuit, the salt pork sliced and wrapped, dried apple. She had done it quietly and efficiently, and without being asked. She was wearing her coat, which was fully dry now and whose mended seam held solid at the shoulder, and she had her bag packed in by the door, and she looked at him when he came in with the calm, steady expression that he had come to understand was her version of readiness. "A few more hours," he said. "I know." She paused. "Are you all right?" He looked at her. It was a genuine question, asked with genuine attention, and it caught him slightly off balance in the way genuine things sometimes did. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer than the answer warranted, and then she nodded, and they sat down to wait for the right hour, and outside the Wyoming night settled dark and cold over the mountain, and the trail south began to harden toward something they could ride. They left at 2 in the morning. Coulter had chosen the hour deliberately, late enough that anyone watching the lower roads would have pulled in for the night, early enough that they could cover the first 15 miles before first light and be well into the foothills by the time the morning made them visible against the landscape. He woke Evelyn at 1:30, not that she had been deeply asleep. He had heard her turn on the bed twice in the hours after they sat down to wait, the particular restless sound of a person whose body wants sleep and whose mind will not cooperate. She was up and ready in 10 minutes, which he had expected. She did not require help with Cass, which he had also expected, though the horse gave her a moment of difficulty at the mounting, sidestepping as Evelyn put her foot in the stirrup, a habit Cass had when the cold made her skittish. Evelyn recovered without panic, which was the right response, and tried again, and Cass accepted her the second time with the grudging equine consent of an animal that has run out of objections. "Good," Coulter said quietly. "Don't," Evelyn said also quietly, but with enough edge in it that he understood she didn't want to be praised for managing a horse in the dark. She wanted to just manage the horse. He respected that and said nothing further about it. The South Trail was hard and uneven, the melt refrozen into a surface that was navigable but required attention, and they rode it single file with Coulter on Dutch in the lead and Evelyn and Cass close behind, close enough that he could hear the mare's breathing in the cold air. There was no moon worth mentioning, just stars in the quantity you only saw at altitude, and the trail was a slightly darker shade against the snow on either side, visible if you knew what to look for. They rode without talking. There was nothing to say that was more important than listening to the mountain, and they both seemed to understand that. The cold was serious, the kind that got into your face and the backs of your hands and the gap between your collar and your hat, and Coulter checked without turning around every 20 minutes or so by the quality of Cass's hoofbeats behind him that they were still moving at a sustainable pace. Twice he slowed Dutch deliberately to let Cass catch up where the trail had given Evelyn trouble. A sharp switchback, then a narrow shelf crossing where the ice was worst. And both times she came through without asking for help or explaining the difficulty. By 4 in the morning, they were off the high trail and onto the Foothills Road, which was a different thing entirely, wider, more protected from the wind, with the cold softened slightly by the pine cover on either side. Coulter pulled Dutch to a walk and let Evelyn come up beside him, and they rode side by side on the wider road in the dark. "You all right?" he asked. "My back is reminding me that I haven't done this in some time," she said. "But yes. We'll stop at the first creek crossing for the horses, 20 minutes. She nodded. They rode in silence for a while, and then she said, "How do you navigate out here in the dark? You haven't hesitated once." "I know this road." He thought about how to explain it more precisely, because it wasn't simply familiarity. When you ride a piece of land long enough, you stop seeing it and start feeling it. The pitch of the slope under the horse, the way the air changes when you're near water, the sound of the wind when there's a rock face on your left versus open ground. He paused. "I couldn't tell you how I know. I just know." She was quiet for a moment. "That's what it felt like in my father's ledgers," she said, "after I'd been keeping them for 2 years. I didn't have to add the columns to know whether they balanced. I'd look at the page and I'd feel it, the way you feel a note that's off-key." She paused. "My father thought it was intuition. I think it was just practice disguised as something mysterious. Maybe they're the same thing. Maybe." They reached the creek crossing just as the sky was beginning to suggest, very faintly, that darkness was a condition that would not last forever. Not light yet, more the idea of light, a thinning at the eastern edge. Coulter watered Dutch and then Cass and let both horses rest while he checked his bearing and thought through the next section of road. Evelyn got down from Cass, which she managed without trouble, and walked a short distance and back, working the stiffness out of her legs without making a performance of it. "How many miles to Beauchamp's?" she asked when she came back. 26 from where we are. We'll make it by mid-afternoon if we keep good pace." "And from Beauchamp's to the Cheyenne Road?" "Day's ride, maybe a little more depending on conditions." He looked at her in the thin pre-dawn. She looked tired the way people look tired when they were managing it correctly. Not defeated, just honest about the cost. "You should eat something." She took a biscuit from the pack without arguing about it, which told him she was hungry enough that pride had temporarily stepped aside. He ate one himself, and they stood beside the horses at the frozen creek edge while the sky continued its slow negotiation with the coming day, and the cold was sharp and clean, and the pines were black against the gray. "Coulter," she said. She was looking at the creek. "Yes." "When we get to the Cheyenne Road, what are you planning to do?" He had been waiting for this question in a general way since the night before, and he had prepared what he thought was a clear and accurate answer. "Ride back," he said. She looked at him. "Back to the cabin." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The creek made its small, cold sound under the ice at the edges. "Just like that. Just like that." He kept his voice even. "You'll be on a clear road with good access to the city. Aldcroft's men are looking in the high country. Not on the main southern approach. You'll have the head start we've bought by leaving at night. He paused. You'll be fine. I know I'll be fine, she said. And then, in a different voice, that's not what I was asking. He looked at her across the space between them, in the pale and growing light, and she looked back at him with the steady, direct honesty that had been her consistent quality from the first full day she had been awake enough to apply it. Evelyn, you don't have to explain yourself, she said. She said it carefully, without any heat. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking what you're planning to do, and you told me, and that's a complete answer. She looked back at the creek. I just wanted to hear it clearly. He was quiet. The horses shifted beside them, breathing steam into the cold air. I built a life on that mountain, he said. I know. It took a long time to build. I know that too. He looked at the side of her face, the straight line of her jaw, the deliberate stillness of someone who is saying something important by not saying it. I don't think I can. He stopped. He was not good at this. He had not had reason to be good at it for 6 years, and the skill, whatever it had been, had rusted badly. I don't know what I'm capable of anymore. In terms of, I genuinely don't know. She turned to look at him then, and her expression was something he had not seen from her before. Not soft exactly. More open. More honestly, whatever it was, rather than the composed version. That, she said, is the most honest thing you've said to me. He did not know what to do with that, so he said, We should get moving. Yes, she said. We should. They mounted up and rode. So, the morning came in full and cold and clear, the kind of winter morning in the high foothills that made the world look like it had been washed and set out to dry. Every edge sharp, every shadow precise, the sky a deep blue that had no interest in being sentimental about anything. They rode at a good pace through the pine corridors of the foothills, covering ground steadily, and the road held up better than Coulter had feared. The melt and refreeze cycle had actually improved some sections, packing the surface into something firm enough to make decent time on. Evelyn had found her seat on Cass more naturally as the miles went on. He had seen it happen, the gradual relaxation of a first-time tension, the body learning what was being asked of it and starting to cooperate rather than resist. She would be sore tomorrow in ways she was not currently anticipating, but that was tomorrow's problem, and she would handle it the same way she handled everything else. Around mid-morning, she said, Tell me about Beauchamp, Pete Beauchamp. He thought about how to describe Pete Beauchamp accurately, which required choosing from several available versions. He came out here from Louisiana about 15 years ago. Nobody knows exactly why he left, and nobody has ever been comfortable enough to ask him directly. He set up the way station because the road needed one, and he needed something to do that suited his particular temperament, which is basically, leave me alone, and I'll leave you alone, and we can conduct whatever business is necessary in a spirit of mutual minimal intrusion. Something at the corner of Evelyn's mouth shifted. A man after your own heart. He's a better talker than me when the occasion calls for it. His wife, Marguerite, she's Shoshone, grew up in the Northern Territory. She's the one who actually runs the station. Pete provides the labor, and she provides the judgment. He paused. You'll like her. Why? Because she doesn't have patience for other people's ideas about what she should be, and she doesn't pretend to. Evelyn looked at him. You've thought about what I'd like. He had, and it had not been entirely a conscious choice when he'd done it. He looked ahead at the road. I mentioned Marguerite because she'll put you at ease about the station, he said. That's a practical observation. Evelyn said in a tone that did not commit to agreeing with that framing. They ate midday in the saddle. He had done this so often it required no adjustment, and Evelyn managed with enough competence that he suspected she had traveled more roughly than her Denver years would suggest. He asked about that, and she said she had spent 6 months the year before her father died traveling the Eastern Territories with a surveying party that a business acquaintance of her father's had organized, ostensibly as a social trip, but actually as a land scouting expedition. That's where I got interested in the land questions, she said, watching how they moved through a territory, how they assessed it, what they valued, and what they dismissed. She held her biscuit carefully in her damaged left hand and broke a piece with her right. They never once asked my opinion. I watched everything and said nothing and wrote down what I observed in a journal that I kept in my bag. She paused. Those 6 months were more useful to me than any formal education would have been. What did you observe? She thought about it. That land is almost never worth exactly what someone says it's worth. That the gap between what it is and what someone claims it is, that gap is always in the direction of whoever has something to gain from the claim. She ate the piece of biscuit. And that the people who actually know the land, who live on it and work it, are almost never the ones in the room when the numbers are being decided. No, he said. They're not. That's what Aldcroft is doing with my land. He's decided what it's worth in the context of what he's assembling, which is a number that has nothing to do with what it actually is. It's just a position on a map that completes a picture he's drawing. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it, the particular tone of someone who has been precise and clear about a wrong that has been done to them and is still waiting for the world to register it. And the thing is, he's probably not even wrong about the value. The coal seam, the creek water access, the position relative to the rail survey. It probably is worth what he thinks it's worth. That's almost the most infuriating part. His assessment is correct. He just doesn't get to make it. Because it's yours, Coulter said. Because it's mine, she said. Simply. Finally, they came into sight of Beauchamp's way station at 2:15 in the afternoon. It sat in a natural clearing in the pines, a main building of solid log construction with a long porch and 2 outbuildings behind it, smoke coming from 2 chimneys, and a fenced paddock on the south side with 4 horses in it. Well-maintained, functional, the kind of place that didn't bother looking like anything other than what it was. Pete Beauchamp was on the porch when they rode up, which probably meant he had heard them coming for the last 10 minutes. He was a large man, dark-skinned, in his late 50s, with a gray-shot beard and the patient, calculating eyes of someone who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. He watched them come into the yard and waited until they pulled up before he said anything. "Hayes," he said. "Pete." Coulter dismounted. "We need a night. 2 horses need feed and rest." Pete looked at Evelyn with no particular expression. "The woman need rest too?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "The woman does." She held his gaze levelly, and Pete's expression shifted by a fraction of a degree in a direction that might have been approval. "Marguerite's inside," he said. "She'll see to you. I'll take the horses." Inside the main building, Marguerite Beauchamp was at the stove in the back room, a compact, dark-haired woman, somewhere in her 40s, with quick, precise movements and eyes that assessed situations and people with the same efficient accuracy. She took one look at Evelyn and said, "Sit down. You've been writing since before the sun came up, I'd guess. Your back is doing you something terrible." Evelyn blinked. "How can you tell? The way you walked in. You're holding your spine like it's disagreeing with you." Marguerite poured something hot from a pot on the stove and set it in front of Evelyn. "Drink that first. Then tell me what you need." Coulter sat across the table, and it was Pete who came in from outside after settling the horses and sat beside him, and they talked in low voices while Marguerite and Evelyn talked in the way that women sometimes talked in the presence of men, openly, because the presence of the men had been factored in and discounted. "You passing through, or is there trouble?" Pete asked, pouring 2 cups of something that turned out to be a strong, dark coffee. "Both," Coulter said. He gave Pete the short version: Evelyn's situation, Aldcroft, the men in the territory, the need to get her to the Cheyenne Road without being intercepted. Pete listened without interrupting. When Coulter finished, Pete turned his cup slowly on the table. "I've heard Aldcroft's name," he said. "He's been buying into the territory for 2 years, you said. More like 3. He had a man out here last autumn, asking about road conditions and the route to Casper. I told him what anyone would tell him, which is that the road is the road, and the conditions are whatever they are." "Did the man say what Aldcroft was after?" "Mineral rights, rail access. The usual arrangement, buy the land cheap from people who don't know what they have, hold it until the rail survey confirms the route, sell to the railroad at 10 times what you paid." Pete's voice was even. He had the tone of someone describing an old and tiresome story. "He's been at it long enough that he's good at it, which means he's not used to anyone saying no." "She said no," Coulter said. "I can see that." Pete glanced toward where Evelyn was sitting with Marguerite. She going to be able to get those papers filed before he finds another angle? If we can get her to the Cheyenne road clear. Once she's in the city, the legal protection is real enough that he can't move on it quickly. He'd need to challenge the inheritance in court, and that takes time he doesn't want to spend. Pete nodded slowly. He turned his cup again. There's something you should know, he said. A rider came through yesterday, moving fast, heading north toward the Whitmore corridor. I didn't think much of it at the time, just a man on a road. But he stopped long enough to water his horse, and I saw him well enough. He had the look of a man on an errand, not a man traveling. He looked at Coulter. He asked if I'd seen a young woman come through, dark-haired, traveling alone or with one other person. The back of Coulter's neck tightened. What did you tell him? I told him I hadn't seen anyone matching that description in the past week, which was true at the time. Pete met his eyes. But he asked about the Foothills Road specifically, which means they're not just watching the main crossings anymore. They know about the alternate routes. Coulter sat with that for a moment. Someone had talked, not necessarily deliberately, just the ordinary leakage of information through the territory's small, interconnected communities. The Hennessy boy on his delivery routes, Walt Greeley's store, where everyone in a 50-mile radius eventually came to buy things. The mention of a Foothills route, overheard or inferred. It didn't matter where exactly the information had come from. It had come. The rider heading north, he said. If he went to Whitmore and found the cabin empty, he'd know which direction you'd come from, Pete said, which gives him a corridor. A pause. The question is whether he went north first or south first. If he went north first, we might have a window. If he went south, there may be someone between here and the Cheyenne Road already. They looked at each other. Pete poured more coffee. Across the room, Evelyn said something that made Marguerite laugh. A genuine laugh, sudden and brief. And Coulter heard it without turning around. He heard Evelyn's voice as well, quieter but warm at the edges. The voice she used when she was not managing something, but just being in a conversation. You're not just escorting her to the road, Pete said. It was not a question. I'm making sure she gets there safely. That's not what I said. Coulter looked at his coffee. She's a woman trying to get somewhere she's chosen to go. I'm a man who knows this territory. That's the whole thing. Pete was quiet for a moment. Then, Marguerite said the same thing to me once, when I drove her north from the station she'd been working at, back when we first met. She said, I am going somewhere I have chosen to go, and I need someone who knows this part of the country. He picked up his cup. 20 years ago. Coulter looked up. Pete's expression was dry, but not unkind. I drove her north, he said. Then I found I had business that kept me in the same general direction for a while. That evening, they ate together around the big table in the main room, all four of them, and it was different from any meal Coulter had eaten in a long time, the warmth of other people's company that was not performance or obligation, but just real. Marguerite had made something with dried beans and pork and spices that she apparently always had in supply, and Coulter ate more of it than he intended to. Evelyn and Marguerite talked through much of the meal, and Coulter listened more than he spoke, which was his natural position and also useful here because the conversation between the two women covered practical ground he needed to understand. Marguerite knew the Southern Road as well as anyone. She had been using it for 15 years, and she had strong views about which stretches were most exposed and where natural cover made it possible to move without being visible from a distance. Below the second ridge, Marguerite said, drawing a rough map on the table with her finger, the road runs parallel to the creek for about 4 miles. Anyone watching from the east, from the ridge above, can see the whole stretch. You don't want to ride that in daylight if there's any question. Can it be ridden before dawn? Evelyn asked. Yes, if you know the creek is on your left and you keep it there. The road doesn't split in that section, so you can't go wrong in the dark. Marguerite looked at her steadily. You've ridden at night before. Tonight. I managed, Evelyn said. You did more than manage. Hayes told Pete you came down off the high trail in full dark on a horse you'd never ridden. Marguerite's expression was matter-of-fact, not flattering. That's not nothing. Evelyn glanced at Coulter and then back at Marguerite. He set a pace I could follow. He set a pace. You followed it. Those are both true, and they're both things someone did. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She looked at the table where Marguerite's finger map had been traced. I'll ride the creek section before dawn, she said. What's after it? After supper, Pete and Coulter sat on the porch while the women went inside, and Pete smoked a pipe and Coulter looked at the night sky and thought. "Tell me what you're actually thinking," Pete said. "I'm thinking about the man on the southern road," Coulter said. "If he went south before going north, he may already be past us. If he's between here and Cheyenne, we need to know where. I can send the boy out at first light, ride south, see what he finds, come back inside 2 hours. That works if we don't leave before then. Leave at dawn instead of before it. The creek section, Marguerite's right about it, but that's only a problem if someone's on the eastern ridge. If the road south of it is clear, you can ride it in full light without much exposure." Coulter thought about the timing. Dawn left the creek section, then the last 18 miles to the Cheyenne Road. A strong morning's ride in good conditions. If the boy's back by 7 and the road is clear, you're at the Cheyenne Junction by early afternoon, Pete said. That was the calculation. It was clean enough, assuming the road was clear. The assumption was the variable he couldn't control. He sat with it for a while in the cold and the dark, and then he went inside. Evelyn was sitting by the stove in the main room, alone. Marguerite had gone back to the kitchen to clean up, and the room was quiet. Evelyn had her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the fire, and she looked up when he came in. "Clear road tomorrow?" she asked. "We'll know by 7. Pete's sending someone to check." She nodded. She looked back at the fire. He pulled a chair from the table and sat near the stove, not next to her, but close enough that they were within the same circle of warmth. "I've been thinking about what you said this morning," she said. "At the creek." He waited. "About not knowing what you're capable of anymore." She did not look at him. "I don't think that's actually true. I think you know exactly what you're capable of. I think the problem is that you're capable of more than you've been willing to risk." She paused. "Which is different." He was quiet. "I'm not saying this to—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not making a case for anything. I'm just saying it because it's true. And because you've been honest with me, and it seems only fair to return that." He looked at the side of her face in the firelight, the straight line of her jaw, the way she held very still when she was being precise about something. "Evelyn," he said. She turned to look at him. He had several versions of what he might say lined up, and he dismissed all of them because they were all some variation of careful, and careful was not what this moment required. "I don't want to ride back alone," he said. "That's the truth of it. I've been riding back alone for 6 years, and I am genuinely tired of it, and you showing up in the snow was inconvenient." Something in her expression broke open, slightly. Not dramatically, just the small, real opening of something that had been held carefully for a long time. "Inconvenient," she said. "Yes. That's one word for it. It's the accurate one." He held her gaze. "I don't know what the right thing is. I don't know what's fair to you, given your situation and where you're trying to get to and what you've said about wanting to stand somewhere on your own terms. I don't want to be another man who decides things about your future without consulting you." He paused. "So I'm consulting you. What do you want?" The fire cracked and settled in the stove. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed cold and dark against the walls of the way station, and Pete Beauchamp smoked his pipe on the porch. And the horses were quiet in the paddock, and the world was doing the thing it always did, going on, indifferent, requiring nothing from either of them. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet and steady and honest. "I want to file my papers," she said. "I want to stand in front of that land office window and have my name put on that document by my own hand." She held his eyes. "And then I want to have a conversation about what comes after, with you, on my own terms." He was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," he said. "It is," she agreed. They sat by the stove in the warmth of the way station while the night worked through its hours. And for the first time since the South Trail had opened, neither of them was thinking about the road ahead with the particular dread of distance. Something had shifted in the geography of the thing. Not resolved. There were still miles ahead and at least one man on a horse somewhere between them and Cheyenne with a description and a purpose. But the thing between them had been named plainly by both parties without anyone revising it into something more comfortable. And it sat in the room with them like an honest and slightly inconvenient fact, which, Coulter thought, looking at the fire, was a better place to start than most. Pete Beauchamp's boy came back at 7:10. His name was Eli, 16 years old, lean and quick on a horse the way young men were when they had grown up on a road rather than in a town. and he came in off the south trail at a canter and swung down in the yard with the slightly breathless energy of someone carrying news he knew mattered. Coulter was already outside, having been outside since 6, and Pete came off the porch to meet his son, and they stood in the cold morning light while Eli told them what he'd found. The road south of the creek section was clear. No riders, no sign of recent camp, no tracks that didn't belong to the ordinary early morning traffic of a road in light use. Eli had gone as far as the fork at Miller's Crossing, 12 miles south, and come back without seeing anything that concerned him. The eastern ridge above the creek stretch had been empty. No one posted there, no sign that anyone had used it as a vantage recently. "The man who came through yesterday," Pete said to Eli, "going north. You didn't pass anyone matching that on the way south?" "No, sir." Eli thought about it with the serious, methodical expression of a boy who had been trained to be accurate. "I didn't pass anyone going north either. Road was quiet all the way to Miller's." Which meant one of two things. Either the rider had continued north toward Whitmore and had not yet come back, or he had taken a different route entirely. Either way, the south road was clear for now, and clear for now was the only condition they had ever been working with. Coulter went inside and told Evelyn. She was at the table with Marguerite, finishing coffee, and she looked up when he came through the door and read the news in his expression before he said it. She set her cup down and stood up. "How long do we have?" "No way to know. The road's clear to Miller's Crossing. After that, it's open country to the Cheyenne Junction, and there's no good ridge to watch from. The terrain flattens out, and there are too many approach angles." He paused. "If we leave in the next half hour, we can make the junction before mid-afternoon." "I'll get my things," she said. Marguerite stood as well and looked at Coulter with the steady, assessing gaze she had applied to everything during their time at the station. "You coming back north after?" she asked. "Depends," he said. Marguerite nodded, as if that were a complete answer, which he supposed it was. She went to the kitchen and came back with a wrapped package that she put in Evelyn's hands. Food for the road, more substantial than what they had left with, organized with the practical efficiency of a woman who had been provisioning travelers for 15 years. "The left saddlebag," Marguerite said to Evelyn. "Keep it balanced." Evelyn held the package and looked at Marguerite with an expression that was trying to be contained and not entirely succeeding. "Thank you," she said. "For last night, for—" She stopped. "Just thank you." Marguerite put a hand briefly on Evelyn's arm. "Go file your papers," she said. "The rest of it will sort itself out." They left at 7:30 into a morning that had gone bright and cold and still, the kind of morning that felt almost too clear, too visible, where every sound carried and the landscape offered nowhere to be anonymous. Coulter set a pace that was strong without being reckless, and Evelyn matched it. Cass was better rested than Dutch, having slightly less distance in her legs from the night before, and she moved with more willingness than she had in the dark hours, settling into a steady, ground-eating trot that covered the miles efficiently. The creek section came and went without incident. The eastern ridge above it was empty, as Eli had reported, just rock and thin pine and the ordinary silence of high ground in winter. Coulter kept his eyes on it as they passed through, methodically scanning the line, and it gave him nothing back. South of the creek, the land began to change the way it always did as you came down out of the foothills. Opening up, the trees thinning, the horizon pulling back to reveal more sky than ground. The road widened. Other tracks appeared in the mud, the evidence of traffic that had moved through in the past day or two. The world got larger and less intimate, which was both reassuring and exposed. They had been riding for 2 hours when Evelyn said, "There's someone behind us." Coulter had already seen it. A rider, maybe a mile back, moving at a pace that was not casual. Not running, but deliberate. Keeping distance but not losing ground. "I see him," Coulter said. "One rider." "Yes." "That's not necessarily Aldcroft's man." "No, it's not necessarily anything." He kept Dutch's pace steady and did not look back again. "Looking back was information you gave away. We don't change anything until we know what it is." They rode another 10 minutes. The rider behind them maintained the distance, not closing, not falling back. Keeping pace. That was more specific than random. Someone riding for their own purposes on their own schedule did not keep a consistent distance behind 2 other riders for 10 straight minutes on an open road. "He's following," Evelyn said. Her voice was even. "Yes," Coulter said. What do we do? He thought about the road ahead. He knew this section, had ridden through it 3 or 4 times over the years on supply runs to the territory office south of Cheyenne. About 2 miles ahead, the road passed through a shallow cut in a low ridge, barely enough to call a ridge, but enough that it put walls on either side for 100 yards. After that, it opened onto the broad, flat approach to Miller's Crossing, where there was a ford, a small cluster of buildings, and enough traffic that a man following 2 riders would either have to reveal himself or pull back. There's a cut in this ridge ahead, he said, 2 miles. When we go into it, we're going to do something. She looked at him. We're going to stop, he said, and he's going to have to either stop with us, which tells us who he is, or ride past, which also tells us. And if he stops, and he's one of Aldcroft's men? Coulter said nothing for a moment. He had the rifle in the saddle scabbard and the pistol on his hip and 6 years of living on a mountain that required him to be capable of whatever the situation required. He was not a violent man by disposition, but disposition and circumstance were different things, and he had never confused them. Let me handle what needs handling, he said. She looked at him steadily. I'm not going to pretend to be helpless. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to let me do the part that involves standing between you and trouble. That's not the same thing. She held his gaze for a moment, and then nodded once, short and clear. They reached the cut in the ridge, and Coulter took Dutch off the road and into the shallow shelter of the rock wall on the left side and turned the horse to face back the way they'd come. Evelyn took Cass to the right wall, 10 feet back, which put her out of the direct sightline from the road entrance, but gave her a clear view of it. He noted that she had chosen the position herself and that it was the correct one, and he said nothing about it. They waited. The rider came into the cut 60 seconds later, alone, on a brown horse that had been pushed hard enough to show sweat on its neck despite the cold. He pulled up sharply when he saw them. Surprise, genuine surprise, the kind that happens before a person can compose their reaction. And Coulter had his hand on the rifle, but not the rifle out, and he read the man in the 2 seconds before anything was said. Mid-40s, average build, a face that was not the face of a man who spent time thinking about violence. There was a quality of desk work to it, indoor work, a man more comfortable with paper than with confrontation. He was wearing a coat that was too good for trail work and boots that were the same. Coulter Hayes, the man said. It was not a question. Who are you? Coulter said. The man reached very deliberately and slowly into his coat pocket, making sure the deliberateness was visible, and produced a folded document. My name is Farrow. I'm an attorney from Cheyenne. I represent the Territorial Land Office and several private parties in matters pertaining to land claims and mineral rights. He held the document out. I've been looking for Miss Evelyn Hart for 11 days. Evelyn came out from the right wall on Cass, which Coulter had not told her to do, and which he was not going to argue about. She stopped beside him and looked at Farrow. On whose behalf? She said. Farrow looked at her with something that was either relief or its close neighbor. Partly the land offices, partly my own firms. And partly... He stopped. He held out the document again, toward her this time. I think you should read this, Miss Hart. She took it. She unfolded it with careful hands and read it in the clear winter light, and Coulter watched her face while she read, because her face was more reliable information than anything else available to him at that moment. He watched the expression change, slowly, then all at once. Aldcroft withdrew, she said. She said it as if she were testing the words, making sure they held weight. 3 days ago, Farrow said, he filed withdrawal papers on the proposed claim against your inheritance. The territorial judge received them on the 12th. He paused. There were also 2 men recalled, employees of Aldcroft's who had been operating in the Northern Territory, recalled by wire. Why? She said. Not the legal reason, the real question. Farrow adjusted himself slightly in the saddle. Because your attorney in Denver, a man named Corbell, filed a counterpetition on your behalf 2 weeks ago. You had apparently sent him a letter before you left the city, outlining the details of the arrangement your father had made and formally disputing its validity. He paused. Corbell is a persistent man. He found 2 other instances in the past 5 years where Aldcroft had used similar arrangements, private deals made with family members of deceased landowners, without the knowledge or consent of the actual heirs. When Corbell made clear that he intended to bring all 3 cases to light simultaneously, in public, in front of the territorial courts, he left the sentence open. Coulter understood the end of it. A man like Aldcroft did not fear legal challenges. He feared public ones. He feared the word fraud attached to his name in a territorial court while he was still assembling the largest land and mineral portfolio in Wyoming, still needing cooperation from local officials and business partners who would read what was said about him and make their own calculations. He folded, Coulter said. He made a strategic decision, Farrow said, with the careful neutrality of a lawyer who understood the difference between what was true and what was provable. The land is yours, Miss Hart, free of encumbrance. The inheritance is clean. You can file with the territorial office as the sole and uncontested owner. He reached into his coat again and produced a second, smaller document. I can also witness your signature on the formal claim today, if you prefer not to wait for a trip to Cheyenne. Evelyn was quiet for a moment that felt very long. Then she said, I want to go to the Cheyenne office. I want to file in person. Farrow blinked. Of course, that's entirely your right. I only offered the alternative in case the trip was difficult. The trip is fine, she said. She folded the document and held it in both hands and looked at it for one more moment. Just looked at it, the paper, the fact of it, and then she tucked it inside her coat. I want to file in person, she said again. I want to be the one standing at that window. Farrow rode with them to the Cheyenne Junction, which he had apparently been heading toward anyway, and then continued south while Coulter and Evelyn came into the city in the late afternoon of a day that had gone golden and long, with the particular beauty of a winter sun burning out at low angle. Cheyenne in winter was mud and cold and commerce, the raw and ongoing business of a city still making itself loud in the way of places where everyone is arriving from somewhere else and trying to establish that they belong. Coulter had been here a handful of times in 6 years and had always been mildly oppressed by the sheer volume of people and intention and noise. He moved through it now without visible reaction, practical and focused, which was the only gear he had. The Territorial Land Office was on the main street, a brick building with a painted sign that swung in the wind. They arrived at 3:30, 45 minutes before closing. The clerk at the window was a young man in his 20s with ink on his fingers and the expression of a person who had processed enough paperwork to have stopped thinking of it as anything other than paperwork. Evelyn went to the window. Coulter stayed back. This was hers, and he knew it, and he stood 10 feet back and watched. She presented the inheritance documents, the originals, which she had been carrying in the lining of her coat through the mountains and the blizzard and the foothills and 2 weeks of running, and which were slightly worse for the experience but entirely legible. She presented Farrow's documentation of the Aldcroft withdrawal. She answered the clerk's questions clearly and without hesitation, and when he asked her to sign, she signed, and when he stamped the document and passed it back under the window, she took it with both hands. The clerk's eyes were on the stamp he was applying to the next form. He did not look up at her. It was, from his side of the window, a routine transaction, one of dozens he processed in a day, names on land, land to names, the endless bureaucratic motion of a territory sorting itself out. Evelyn looked at the stamped document in her hands. She looked at it the way you look at something you had stopped believing in and then recovered. Not with triumph, because triumph would have been too light for the weight of what it had cost to get there, just with the clear, specific recognition of a thing being true. She turned around. She looked at Coulter across the room. He nodded. That was all. She walked back to him, and they went out together into the cold street. Outside, she stood on the wooden sidewalk with the document in her hands, and the city moving around her and the late sun catching the ice on the storefronts across the street and turning it to fire, and she did not say anything for a long moment. He stood beside her and gave her the moment without filling it. "It's done," she said finally. "Yes, it's actually done." "It is." She looked up at the sky, briefly, the way people do when they don't want anyone to see their face for a second. When she looked back down, she was composed, but her eyes were bright in a way that was different from cold. "I was afraid it wouldn't feel like anything," she said, "when it happened. I was afraid I had built it up so much in my mind that the actual moment would be smaller than I'd imagined." "Is it?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "It's exactly as big as I thought it would be." A pause. "Which is strange, because I also feel like I could fall asleep standing up, and I haven't eaten a full meal since Marguerite fed us last night, and I'm cold and my back is still complaining. She looked at the document in her hands. And it's still as big as I thought. That's usually how the important things go, he said. She looked at him. What now? It was the same question Pete Beauchamp had asked, more or less. And Coulter had given an incomplete answer then because he had not yet been ready to give the complete one. He was ready now. He had been working toward ready for the better part of 24 hours, and the work was done. I need to find a stable for the horses, he said. And we both need a meal and a night that isn't spent on a pallet by a stove. He paused. And then I'd like to have the conversation you mentioned, about what comes after, if you still want to have it. She looked at him for a moment with the full weight of her attention, which he had learned was a substantial thing. I still want to have it, she said. Good, he said. Then let's start with dinner. They stayed in Cheyenne for 2 days. It was longer than strictly necessary, and shorter than he might have chosen, and the time was used for practical things. The horses needed proper rest and feed. Evelyn needed to meet with a local attorney to review Pharaoh's documentation and ensure the filing was airtight, and there were supply purchases to make for the ride north. These were the visible purposes of the 2 days. The other purpose was the conversation. Not one single conversation, but the ongoing kind. Over dinner the first night, which was a meal in a small restaurant off the main street that managed to be warm and reasonably quiet, and over breakfast the next morning, and on a walk along the less trafficked streets while the horses rested. The slow, exploratory kind of talk that happens when two people who have been managing practical emergencies for 2 weeks finally find themselves without an immediate emergency to manage. It was not a simple conversation. It was not the kind of conversation that resolved cleanly into a plan both people agreed to and shook hands on. It was harder than that, and more honest, and it covered ground that neither of them would have been comfortable covering 10 days ago. She said, I need you to understand that the land is mine. Whatever I do with it, wherever I am, whatever decisions get made about it, those are mine. Not negotiable. He said, I know that. She looked at him. I'm not sure you do. Not because I don't trust you specifically, because I've learned not to assume that anyone understands it until I've said it out loud. Then I'm telling you out loud, he said. The land is yours. I don't want your land. I have my own land. She was quiet for a moment, then, what do you want? He thought about Pete Beauchamp, who had driven a woman north and then found he had business in that direction for 20 years. He thought about Sarah, who had hated cold weather and come to the mountain anyway and been right about the windows. He thought about the cabin and the quality of it now in his memory. Still his, still the thing he had built, but different, containing the echo of another person who had moved through it and changed the air. I want to stop reducing my life down to only the things I can't lose, he said. It was the plainest version of it, and therefore the accurate one. I've been doing that for 6 years, and I'm tired of it. He met her eyes. I want to see what it looks like to build something again. I'm not telling you that's a plan. I'm telling you that's what I want. She sat with that for a long moment. I'm not Sarah, she said. Not harshly, just clearly. No, he said. You're not. And I'm not whoever you imagined you'd end up building something with, back before your father died, and Aldcroft and the mountains, and all of it. He paused. We're just what we actually are. I think that's enough to start with. Evelyn looked at him across the table in the small, warm restaurant, with the winter city going about its business outside the window, and what moved across her face in that moment was not a decision being made. It was a decision that had already been made, that she was only now allowing to be visible. The land east of Casper, she said, 400 acres. There's a creek and a coal seam, and approximately nothing in the way of existing structure. She looked at him steadily. A person would need to know how to build. I know how to build, he said. I know you do, she said. I've seen your work, yeah. They rode north 3 days after they had arrived in Cheyenne, back up through the foothills, back through the territory that had tried to swallow her and had not managed it. The roads were better than they had been on the way down. A full day of mild temperatures had cleared the worst of the ice, and they made good time. And Evelyn rode Cass with the comfortable ease of a person who had stopped negotiating with the animal and started simply riding. They stopped at Beauchamp's on the way through. Pete was on the porch, which Coulter suspected was a permanent condition, and he looked at both of them coming into the yard and said nothing for a long moment, and then said, "Marguerite will want to know how it went." "Tell her it went," Coulter said. Pete looked at the two of them, at whatever it was that sat differently between them now than it had when they had ridden out, and nodded, and the nod contained a large quantity of things that he chose not to put into words, which was Pete Beauchamp's great social gift. Marguerite did come out, and Evelyn told her about the land office window and the clerk and the stamp on the document, and Marguerite listened with the straight-backed, quiet attentiveness of someone receiving news that they had been holding space for. When Evelyn finished, Marguerite said, "Good." Just that. And it was enough. They stayed for dinner and left in the early evening, heading back up toward the high country, and the mountains came back into view as the sun dropped, the peaks catching the last of the light while everything below had already gone to shadow, the way they always did, those high places holding on to the day a little longer than anything beneath them. Coulter looked at them and felt the particular combination of recognition and relief that came from returning to a place that was genuinely yours. Not borrowed, not provisional. His. Beside him, Evelyn was looking at the mountains too. He did not know what she felt when she looked at them, whether they were still the thing that had almost killed her, or whether they had become something else in the intervening weeks. He would find out. He had the sense, not certain, nothing was certain, that he had time to find out. "Your cabin," she said, not looking away from the peaks. "How many windows does it have?" He thought about it. 3. 1 on the east wall, 2 on the south. "You should have a north window." "The north wall is against the granite shelf." "I know. I looked at it." She finally glanced at him. "But the north light in the afternoon in a valley like this, it's a different quality, softer. You'd want it for reading." A pause. "There's probably a way to do it that doesn't compromise the insulation too badly." He thought about Sarah arguing with him about the windows. He thought about how he had told Evelyn that story and how she had listened. He thought about the particular and ongoing nature of people who knew what they wanted from a space and said so directly. "You'd have to look at the wall," he said. "I've looked at the wall," she said. "I thought about it while you were riding out to check the trail." He looked at her for a moment, at the plain and unself-conscious certainty of it, the way she had seen a problem and already begun working on it, without asking permission, without waiting to see if the wall was hers to think about. Just thinking about it because it was there, and she was a person who looked at things and thought about them and said what she found. "We'll look at it together," he said. She turned back to the mountains. "Yes," she said, "we will." There's a thing that people rarely talk about honestly, which is this. Starting over is not the romantic and relatively painless affair that stories usually make it. It is slow. It is full of ordinary difficulty and small disappointments and days where the work doesn't go well and the weather doesn't cooperate. And two people who have each spent years managing their own solitude discover, sometimes abruptly, that sharing a space requires constant negotiation and adjustment and the willingness to be wrong about things you were certain you were right about. Coulter and Evelyn were not exempted from any of this. They spent the first months working between two properties, the cabin in the high country and the land east of Casper, which required more than the surveying manual had suggested and less than the worst-case assessment. The coal seam was real but small, too small for the kind of industrial extraction Aldcroft had been planning. The creek was reliable and generous. The land was good. It would take years to be what it could be, which was the truth about most things worth building. They argued. They argued specifically about the north window, which Coulter spent 2 weeks claiming was structurally impractical and then built, because she had been correct about the insulation solution and he had been incorrect, and he was slowly getting better at saying so out loud without taking 3 days to work up to it. They argued about the kitchen layout at the Casper property and about how much credit to extend to a family of settlers who needed supplies but were short on cash, and about whether the bay mare Cass was Evelyn's horse now or still technically his, a dispute that was resolved when Evelyn pointed out that Cass had stopped responding to his command 6 weeks prior and was making her own position on the matter clear. Walt Greeley and Whitmore had opinions, as Walt always did, and expressed them to Coulter in the roundabout way that Walt had learned to use with him. Not directly, but as observations about the general nature of things that anyone paying attention would understand the application of. Coulter paid attention and thanked him for the observations and continued on. The town adjusted, as towns do, when the adjustment became an established fact rather than a topic of speculation. Pete Beauchamp rode up to the cabin in the early spring to return a piece of equipment he had borrowed, and stayed for dinner and sat on the porch with Coulter afterward and smoked his pipe and did not say much and said exactly enough. Marguerite sent word through Pete that the north window had been a good decision and that she expected to see it herself when she came through in the summer. Aldcroft never made another move on the Casper land. The public nature of his withdrawal, filed in the territorial courts and therefore a matter of record, was precisely the deterrent Corbell had calculated it would be. Men like Aldcroft understood cost-benefit with a precision that was almost elegant. The cost of pursuing Evelyn Hart's 400 acres had become greater than the benefit, and he had moved on to other pieces of his larger assembly, and the territory was large enough that their paths did not cross again. She filed the formal development claim on the Casper land on a Tuesday in early March, standing at the same window with a different clerk who did look up at her when he stamped the papers, because she had asked him a direct question just before he stamped them, and he had answered it, and somewhere in the exchange he had recognized that he was talking to someone who would remember whether he answered properly, and he had adjusted accordingly. She told Coulter about it when she got back, not dramatically, just as a fact. The clerk had looked up. She said it the way you note something that confirms a long-standing point without making a celebration of the confirmation. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was." There is something to be said about what fear costs. Not fear of the wilderness, not fear of hard weather or hard men. Those are manageable fears, practical ones. The kind you put on like a coat and work through because the alternative is standing still and freezing. The fear that costs most is the small interior kind. The fear of wanting something and losing it. The fear that makes a man build his life around a mountain and call the smallness of it peace. The fear that makes a woman run not towards something but away from wanting, because wanting has been used against her so many times that it has started to feel like a vulnerability she cannot afford. Coulter had been afraid for 6 years. He had been so practiced at the fear that he had mistaken it for preference. Evelyn had been afraid too. Afraid in a different shape, the fear of someone who has watched the systems supposed to protect her be used as instruments against her, and who has learned to trust nothing that she did not build or choose herself. That fear did not disappear because she filed papers at a territorial office. It stayed with her, reshaped itself, became something she carried without letting it carry her. Neither of them arrived at any easy peace with these things. That is not the kind of story this is. What they arrived at, slowly and imperfectly and with a substantial amount of difficulty, was the practice of choosing. Every day the practice of choosing. The land, the work, the conversation at the end of the day, the argument that needed having and the one that could wait. The window in the north wall that let in the soft afternoon light, the mended coat on the peg by the door, the horses in the paddock, and the smell of something actually cooking on the stove. The choosing was not the same as certainty. It was better than certainty. Certainty is a condition, something you either have or you don't. Choosing is an action, something you do again every morning when you get up and the day is in front of you and you decide again what you're going to make of it. The first winter they spent mostly in the cabin. The storms came back to the Wyoming peaks the way they always did. Without ceremony, without warning, with the complete indifference of weather that has no opinion about what it buries or what it reveals. Coulter sat by the fire one evening in January and watched Evelyn at the table with the land survey maps spread out in front of her, her damaged hands moving over the paper with the precise, unhurried confidence of someone who has long since made peace with what she is doing and why. The north window was dark, the mountain pressing its cold and black weight against the glass. But it was good glass, properly set, and the light it let in during the day, the soft reading light she had described on the road to Cheyenne, was exactly what she had said it would be. The cabin was warmer than it had ever been. This was partly the window, which had improved the insulation logic of the south wall in a way he had not expected. It was partly the stove, which Evelyn had adjusted through a process of methodical experimentation that he had watched with the specific pleasure of seeing someone be very good at a thing. And it was partly the fact, the plain, ordinary, deeply inconvenient and essential fact, that two people in a space changed the space. He had known this once. He had known it, and then he had spent 6 years unlearning it, convincing himself that he didn't need what he had lost, and the convincing had been so thorough and so practiced that he had nearly missed the moment when a woman arrived half buried in the snow on the western ridge and began, without intending to make that argument irrelevant. She looked up from the maps. She caught him watching, and her expression did the thing it did sometimes, the thing he had come to recognize as hers specifically, not quite a smile, but something that lived in the same territory. Warmer than composure, more honest than performance. The east parcel, she said. I think the creek access is better than the original survey shows. The bend moves in the spring and the usable bank is probably 20 feet wider by May. That changes the irrigation calculation, he said. Yes, significantly. She looked back at the map. I want to ride out there when the thaw starts. See it myself. We can do that, he said. She nodded, already working again, her finger tracing the line of the creek on the survey paper, the lamplight catching the faded scars on her hands from that first terrible night, when he had dug her out of 3 feet of snow and carried her home without knowing what he was bringing with her. Outside, the mountain held its cold and its silence and its absolute indifference, the way it always had, the way it would long after both of them were gone. It was not a romantic indifference. It was simply the nature of the place, vast, demanding, unmoved by human need or human loss, or the small, persistent human insistence on building something worth keeping in the shadow of everything that could take it away. They had built it anyway. They were still building it. That was the whole story, and it was enough.